Lieutenant Clarence Smoyer sat in the gunner's position of his M4A1 Sherman tank, designated Eagle 7, watching through his periscope as a German Panther tank reversed into position 300 yards down the Cologne street. It was March 6, 1945. The war in Europe had been grinding forward for 9 months since Normandy, and Smoyer had learned through bitter experience what happened when a 75mm Sherman faced a Panther. The German tank's frontal armour was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, providing effective protection equivalent to 140mm against direct fire. His standard armour-piercing rounds bounced off like pebbles thrown against a steel door. But today was different. Today, Smoyer had 3 rounds of M93 HVAP ammunition loaded in his rack. High-velocity armour-piercing, tungsten-cored projectiles that left the barrel at 3,400 feet per second, nearly 1,000 feet per second faster than standard ammunition. He had been issued these rounds only 2 days earlier, pulled from a carefully guarded supply that was rationed across the entire 3rd Armoured Division at a rate of 4 rounds per tank. 4 rounds. That was all the American industrial complex, with its vast productive capacity, could spare for each 76mm Sherman in the European theatre. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Panther's commander was exposed in his cupola, scanning for targets. Smoyer could see him clearly, a young man perhaps 20 years old, wearing the black uniform of the Panzerwaffe. The German tank's long 75mm KWK-42 gun swept across the rubble-strewn intersection, searching. That gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armour at 2,000 yards. Smoyer knew this because he had seen it happen. He had watched as tanks in his unit were struck from ranges where American gunners couldn't even identify the source of fire, let alone return it effectively. His commander, Bob Early, gave the order quietly over the intercom. Gunner, Sabre, tank. Sabre was the crew's nickname for HVAP rounds, derived from the French word for the wooden shoe-shaped sleeve that held the tungsten penetrator in the barrel. Smoyer confirmed he had HVAP loaded. His hands moved through the familiar motions: traverse right, elevate slightly, center the reticle on the Panther's turret face. The German tank was hull down behind rubble, presenting only its turret and the upper glacis plate. Early waited. The Panther commander dropped into his turret and buttoned up. The German tank began to traverse its gun toward their position. Smoyer felt his heartbeat in his ears. In 3 seconds, maybe 4, that Panther would fire. Its round would penetrate Eagle 7's armour and kill everyone inside. This was the players. Mathematics of armoured combat in 1945. German tanks had better guns and better armour. American tanks had numbers, and occasionally, rarely, they had HVAP ammunition. "Fire," Early said. Smoyer pressed the firing mechanism. The 76mm gun recoiled with a sharp crack that was different from the sound of standard ammunition, higher pitched, more violent. Through the smoke and dust, Smoyer watched the tracer arc across the 300 yards separating the 2 tanks. The round struck the Panther's turret face just left of the gun mantlet. There was a bright flash, a shower of sparks, and the sound of metal tearing. The Panther shuddered. Smoke began pouring from the turret hatches. The round had penetrated. For Clarence Smoyer, who had spent 9 months watching American tanks burn because their guns couldn't defeat German armour at combat ranges, this moment represented something more than tactical success. It represented the answer to a question that had haunted American tank crews since Normandy. Could they actually fight German armour on equal terms, or were they simply mobile coffins waiting for the inevitable moment when superior German guns found them? The HVAP round had penetrated 80mm of face-hardened armour at 300 yards, and it had done so decisively, completely. But the story of how American crews received this capability, and why they received so little of it, reveals truths about industrial warfare that transcend any single engagement on the streets of Cologne. When American Sherman tanks rolled off the landing craft onto the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, their crews carried with them a profound misunderstanding about the nature of the enemy they would face. The Sherman, in its original form, mounting a 75mm M3 gun, had been designed based on intelligence and combat experience from North Africa. American armor doctrine assumed that tanks would primarily fight infantry, support breakthroughs, and occasionally engage enemy armor at close ranges, where maneuverability and rate of fire mattered more than penetrating power. The 75mm gun fired an M61 armor-piercing round with a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. At 500 yards, this round could penetrate approximately 3 inches of vertical armor plate. Against Italian tanks in North Africa, against Japanese armor in the Pacific, this was more than adequate. The Sherman had proven itself a capable, reliable vehicle. It was mechanically sound, easily maintained, comfortable for its 5-man crew, and available in numbers that reflected American industrial capacity. By June 1944, American factories had produced over 40,000 Sherman tanks in various configurations. But Normandy was not North Africa. The German army that American forces encountered in the hedgerows of France deployed armor that had been forged in the brutal access, crucible of the Eastern Front. The Panther tank, designated Panzerkampfwagen V, mounted a 75mm Queller K42 liters, 70 gun that fired armor-piercing rounds at 3,000 feet per second. Its frontal armor was 80mm thick on the glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical, providing effective protection against all but the most powerful Allied guns at typical combat ranges. The Panther could engage and destroy Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. The Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor even at point-blank range. The Tiger I heavy tank presented an even more formidable challenge. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges approaching 2,000 yards. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100mm thick on the hull front, providing immunity to the Sherman's 75mm gun at virtually all combat ranges when struck at optimal angles. American crews who encountered Tigers in Normandy discovered that their primary anti-tank weapon was effectively useless in frontal engagements. The psychological impact on American tank crews was immediate and severe. After-action reports from the weeks following D-Day reveal a consistent pattern. Crews reported feeling helpless when encountering German armor. They described watching their armor-piercing rounds bounce off Panther and Tiger armor, while German return fire penetrated Sherman armor with devastating effect. Tank commanders reported that their men were reluctant to advance when intelligence suggested German armor was present. Some units experienced what would later be classified as combat exhaustion at rates significantly higher than infantry units, despite spending less time in direct contact with the enemy. The problem was not unknown to American military leadership. Ordnance officers had been tracking German armor development throughout the Pers War. Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front had warned that German tanks were becoming progressively better armed and armored. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox had tested captured German tanks and understood their capabilities. But the American response was constrained by industrial realities, doctrinal assumptions, and the immense logistical challenge of fighting a global war on 2 fronts. The solution that emerged was not a new tank. American factories were committed to Sherman production, and introducing a new design would have disrupted the supply chain that was keeping Allied armies mobile across Europe. Instead, the solution was a new gun. The 76mm M1A1 gun, a higher-velocity weapon designed specifically to defeat the frontal armor of German medium tanks. Development had begun in 1942, but production and deployment proceeded slowly, delayed by debates over doctrine, concerns about the gun's effectiveness, and the practical challenges of modifying Sherman turrets to accommodate the larger weapon. American armored doctrine in 1944 was built on assumptions that had been reasonable when formulated, but proved dangerously inadequate when tested against German armor in Western Europe. The fundamental premise was that tanks should avoid fighting other tanks. Tank destroyers, specialized vehicles with powerful guns mounted on mobile chassis, would engage enemy armor. Tanks would exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, and engage soft targets. This division of labor made sense on paper and reflected a rational allocation of resources. The M10 tank destroyer mounted a 3-inch gun that could defeat most German armor at combat ranges. The M18 Hellcat, introduced in 1944, was fast and carried a 76mm gun. On paper, American forces had the firepower to engage German armor. In practice, the system broke down under the conditions of actual combat. Tank destroyers were not always available when tanks encountered enemy armor. German tanks operating in small groups or as individual vehicles often engaged American tank columns before tank destroyers could be brought forward. The hedgerow terrain of Normandy limited visibility and maneuver, forcing engagements at close range where the doctrinal separation between tanks and tank destroyers became meaningless. Sherman crews found themselves fighting Panther and Tiger tanks because those were the enemy vehicles they encountered, regardless of what doctrine said they should or should not engage. And they were losing. The exchange ratio in Normandy during June and July 1944 was approximately 1 German tank destroyed for every 5 Allied tanks lost. Some estimates placed the ratio even higher. American armor officers began filing urgent requests for better guns, better armor, better something that would allow their men to fight on equal terms. The 76mm armed Sherman began reaching frontline units in July 1944. The gun was a significant improvement over the 75mm. The M1A1 fired an M62 armor-piercing round at 2,900 feet per second, 300 feet per second faster than the 75mm. At 500 yards, the M62 could penetrate approximately 3 3/4 inches of vertical armor. This was better, measurably better, but it was not enough. A Panther's frontal armor, when considered with its slope, still provided effective immunity at typical combat ranges. The 76mm Sherman could defeat a Panther from the side or rear, and it could penetrate the turret face at close range if the shot struck at favorable angles. But frontal engagements remained lopsided affairs where German armor held decisive advantages. American crews training on the new 76mm Shermans in England before deployment to France were briefed on the gun's capabilities and limitations. They were told to aim for weak points, to maneuver for flank shots, to use terrain and combined arms tactics to overcome the enemy's material advantages. They were told that American industry was working on improved ammunition. They were told to make do with what they had, because nothing better was available in sufficient quantities to change the tactical situation. What they were not told, because even senior American officers did not fully understand it yet, was that a solution existed. A round had been developed that could defeat 80mm of sloped armor at ranges that would fundamentally change the balance of armored combat in Western Europe. That round was the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing projectile, and its story reveals how industrial capacity, material scarcity, and bureaucratic inertia can conspire to deny soldiers the tools they need, even when those tools exist. The M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round was a marvel of metallurgical engineering that existed in armor, quantities too small to matter for most of the men who needed it. Development began in Ernen in 1943, when the Ordnance Department recognized that standard armor-piercing ammunition would be inadequate against the frontal armor of German heavy tanks. The solution was a sub-caliber penetrator, a tungsten carbide core wrapped in a lightweight aluminum sabot that gave the projectile its full 76mm diameter in the barrel, but separated upon leaving the muzzle, allowing the dense tungsten core to fly toward the target at extreme velocity. Tungsten was the critical element. With a density of 19.3 grams per cubic centimetre, nearly twice that of lead and 2.5 times that of steel, tungsten could maintain momentum and punch through armour that would defeat conventional steel penetrators. The M93 round contained approximately 1 pound of tungsten carbide in its penetrator core. When fired from the 76mm M1A1 gun, the projectile achieved a muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second. At 500 yards, the M93 could penetrate approximately 5 inches of vertical armor plate. At 1,000 yards, it could still penetrate 4.5 inches. At 2,000 yards, the extreme range for accurate tank gunnery under most conditions, the M93 retained sufficient energy to penetrate approximately 3.75 inches of vertical armor. These numbers translated into battlefield capability that American tank crews had been desperately seeking. A Panther's 80mm frontal glacis, sloped at 55 degrees, provided effective protection equivalent to approximately 140 millimeters against conventional armor-piercing rounds striking at perpendicular angles. But the M93's extreme velocity and tungsten penetrator could defeat this armor at ranges up to 1,000 yards under favorable conditions. The Panther's turret face, with its less severe angles, was vulnerable to the M93 at ranges approaching 1,500 yards. Even the Tiger I's 100mm frontal armor, previously considered immune to American tank guns, could be penetrated by M93 rounds at close to medium ranges when shot struck at optimal angles. The men of the 3rd Armored Division, who would be among the first to receive HVAP ammunition in significant quantities, learned about the new round through technical bulletins distributed in February 1945. The bulletins provided penetration data, handling instructions, and tactical guidance. Crews were instructed that HVAP rounds were to be used exclusively against armoured targets. The tungsten penetrator was wasted on soft targets or fortifications. Each round was precious and must be employed where its unique capabilities justified its use. Gunners were trained to identify the round by the distinctive silver colour of its aluminum sabot and the letter T stamped on the base. But the quantity available was shockingly small. 3rd Armoured Division, with approximately 230 tanks in its inventory in February 1945, received an initial allocation of approximately 800 M93 rounds. That worked out to roughly 3 to 4 rounds per tank. Subsequent allocations through March and April 1945 brought the total to perhaps 6 to 8 rounds per tank by the time of the Rhine crossing. Some tanks received more, some received less, depending on their mission and the judgment of company commanders about which crews were most likely to encounter enemy armor. The scarcity was not a result of American industrial incapacity. United States factories in 1945 were producing artillery ammunition at rates that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier. Production facilities operated continuously, employing hundreds of thousands of workers in a supply chain that delivered millions of rounds per month to forces in Europe and the Pacific. The constraint was tungsten itself. The United States had limited domestic tungsten deposits. Most tungsten came from China, transported across Japanese-controlled waters at great risk, or from South American sources that could only deliver limited quantities. The tungsten that did reach American shores was allocated across multiple competing demands. Aircraft engines required tungsten steel for exhaust valves that could withstand extreme temperatures. Machine tools needed tungsten carbide cutting edges to maintain the precision manufacturing that kept American factories productive. Artillery shells, particularly those designed to penetrate concrete fortifications, used tungsten. Anti-tank mines incorporated tungsten components. The Strategic Materials Allocation Board, responsible for distributing scarce materials across the war economy, had to balance all these demands against the requirement for armor-piercing ammunition. The result was that even in March 1945, with Allied armies driving into the heart of Germany and encountering the last organized resistance of Panzer divisions defending their homeland, American tank crews had only a handful of rounds that could reliably defeat German heavy armor at the ranges where combat actually occurred. Every other round in their ammunition racks was standard M92 armor-piercing, adequate against side and rear armor, marginal against frontal armor, and utterly ineffective against hull-down Panthers engaging at long range. Crews learned to identify targets carefully before expending HVAP rounds. A Panzer IV medium tank, with its 80mm frontal armor laid at a shallow angle, could be defeated by standard ammunition and did not justify using precious tungsten-cored projectiles. A Stug 3 assault gun, essentially a turretless tank destroyer mounting a 75mm gun, had the same armor as a Panzer IV and represented a similar calculation. But a Panther, or Tiger, absolutely demanded HVAP if available, because no other ammunition in a Sherman's rack had any realistic chance of penetrating frontal armor at combat ranges. Tank commanders made agonizing decisions: fire HVAP at the first sight of heavy German armor and maximize the chance of a first-round kill, but risk expending the round on a target that might be destroyed by conventional means with good shot placement and luck. Or hold HVAP in reserve, engage with standard ammunition first, and accept the risk that the German tank would destroy you before you could employ your most effective round. These were not theoretical dilemmas discussed in training. These were life and death calculations made by 22-year-old sergeants commanding tanks in combat. The evidence that HVAP ammunition fundamentally changed the calculus of armoured combat came not from carefully controlled tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground, though those tests had provided the technical data that justified production. The evidence came from streets and fields across Germany in the final months of the war, from engagements where American crews used tungsten-cored rounds and discovered that their tanks were no longer helpless against German armor. The engagement in Cologne on March 6, 1945, was one such moment, captured on film by a cameraman from the Signal Corps who happened to be in position when Clarence Smoyer's tank encountered the Panther. Smoyer's crew had been advancing through Cologne for 2 days as part of Task Force Wellborn, 3rd Armoured Division. The city was a maze of rubble where buildings had collapsed into streets and shell craters pocked every intersection. German resistance was fierce but fragmentary. Small groups of infantry with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, isolated tank destroyers, and occasional Panthers from the 9th Panzer Division that had been pulled back into the city for its defence. Smoyer's tank, Eagle 7, was a 76mm Sherman that had been with the division since the Normandy breakout. It bore the scars of 8 months of combat, dents and scrapes on the hull, spare track links welded to the glacis for additional protection, sandbags piled on the forward hull to absorb Panzerfaust warheads. On the morning of March 6th, Eagle 7 was advancing down a broad street toward Cologne Cathedral when radio reports indicated German armour ahead. The company commander ordered tanks to spread out and advance with caution. Smoyer, in his gunner's position, scanned through his periscope as the tank rolled forward at walking pace. The loader, Frank Ordifred, had 3 HVAP rounds in the ready rack, taken from the 6 rounds allocated to their tank for the Cologne operation. The remaining ammunition was standard M62 armor-piercing. The Panther appeared as Eagle 7 reached an intersection. It was backing into position approximately 300 yards down a side street, moving deliberately, its commander exposed in the cupola directing the driver. Smoyer recognized it immediately: the distinctive sloped armor, the long gun, the interleaved road wheels that characterized German heavy tanks. Bob Early, the tank commander, made the decision without hesitation. Gunner, Sabo, tank. Sabo was the crew's shorthand for HVAP, adopted because the full designation was too cumbersome for combat communication. Smoyer confirmed he had HVAP loaded. The round had been sitting in the ready rack since morning, positioned for immediate use because intelligence had indicated Panthers were operating in this sector. He traversed right, bringing the gun to bear on the Panther's turret. The German tank was hull down, only its turret and upper glacis visible behind a pile of rubble. That actually simplified the shot. The turret face was less steeply angled than the glacis and represented a more favourable target for penetration. The Panther's commander dropped into his turret, and the hatch clanged shut. The German gunner began traversing toward Eagle 7's position. Smoyer could see the long 75mm gun swinging toward them, could calculate that in seconds they would be under fire from a weapon that could penetrate their armour at this range without difficulty. Early's voice came over the intercom, calm despite the situation. Fire. The 76mm gun fired. The sharp crack was distinctive, different from the deeper boom of the 75mm gun that most Shermans carried. Through the smoke, Smoyer watched the tracer. The round struck the Panther's turret face just left of the gun mantlet with a bright flash. There was no ricochet spark, no sign that the round had deflected. Instead, Smoyer saw the turret shudder. Smoke began pouring from the commander's cupola and the loader's hatch. The Panther was penetrated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What happened next was captured on 16mm film by Sergeant Jim Bates, a Signal Corps cameraman who had been filming the advance from a position behind Eagle 7. His footage shows the Panther burning, shows smoke pouring from the turret, shows crew members attempting to bail out. One German tanker emerges from the loader's hatch and falls from the turret, either hit by small arms fire or overcome by smoke. The footage runs for 18 seconds and provides visual documentation of what a tungsten-cored round could do to 80mm of face-hardened armour. Inside Eagle 7, Smoyer's reaction was not triumph, but a kind of stunned relief. He had fired HVAP rounds in training at the range near Stolberg 6 weeks earlier, had watched the penetrator punch through armour plate targets at 500 yards. But training was abstractions. Steel plates set up on frames, not enemy tanks with crews inside them trying to kill you. This was real. The round had penetrated. The Panther was destroyed. After 8 months of watching German guns defeat Sherman armour, while American guns bounced off German tanks, Smoyer had just killed a Panther from the front at 300 yards with a single shot. For the other crews in Task Force Wellborn, word of the engagement spread quickly. Radio traffic carried reports that Eagle 7 had knocked out a Panther with HVAP. Tank commanders who had been hoarding their few tungsten-cored rounds, uncertain whether the penetration data from technical bulletins would hold up under combat conditions, now had confirmation. The rounds worked. They worked decisively. A properly aimed HVAP round could defeat the frontal armour that had made Panthers nearly invulnerable to American tank guns throughout the previous year of fighting. The broader evidence came from engagement reports filed throughout March and April 1945 as American armoured divisions pushed into Germany. Third, Armoured Division after-action reports from the Rhine crossing and the advance toward the Ruhr documented 17 confirmed tank versus tank engagements, where M93 HVAP rounds were employed. In 14 of those engagements, the first HVAP round fired achieved penetration and destroyed or disabled the target. The 3 failures were attributed to shot placement errors or extreme range engagements beyond 1,500 yards, where even tungsten-cored rounds lost sufficient velocity to reliably defeat heavy armour. 4th Armoured Division reports from the same period documented similar results. 9th Armoured Division, which crossed the Remagen Bridge in early March and exploited deep into the German rear, reported that HVAP-equipped tanks achieved a first-round hit probability against German armour that was approximately 60% higher than tanks firing standard ammunition. The tungsten penetrator's flat trajectory and high velocity made range estimation less critical and allowed gunners to engage successfully at distances where conventional ammunition required multiple ranging shots. But the quantities remained inadequate. 7th Army supply records from March 1945 indicate that total HVAP allocation for all armoured units under 7th Army Command was approximately 12,000 rounds for the entire month. 7th Army had roughly 800 tanks in its subordinate units. That worked out to 15 rounds per tank, which sounds adequate until one considers that tanks fired dozens or hundreds of rounds in a typical week of combat. A tank advancing across Germany in March 1945 might engage bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank gun positions, trucks, half-tracks, and armoured vehicles. Each engagement consumed ammunition. The 15 HVAP rounds had to be preserved for the specific moment when an American tank encountered a Panther or Tiger, while all other targets were engaged with conventional ammunition. Tank commanders developed informal rationing systems. Some held all HVAP rounds in reserve until contact with heavy German armour was confirmed. Others loaded one HVAP round in the ready rack and kept the rest in protected stowage, gambling that if they encountered a Panther, they would have time to fire the ready round before being destroyed. Still others distributed HVAP rounds based on crew proficiency, giving the precious ammunition to their best gunners on the theory that expert marksmanship would make each round count. The scarcity created a bitter irony that was not lost on the men doing the fighting. American industry could produce thousands of tanks, millions of artillery shells, unlimited quantities of fuel and spare parts and rations, and every other material requirement of modern war. But the one item that could actually even the odds in tank combat, the one piece of technology that allowed a Sherman to fight a Panther on equal terms, remained in perpetually short supply because of a strategic material shortage that no amount of industrial capacity could overcome in the time remaining before the war ended. Crews who had fought through Normandy, across France, through the Siegfried Line, and into Germany with standard 76mm ammunition, found themselves wondering what might have been different if HVAP had been available in quantity 6 months earlier. How many tanks would not have been destroyed? How many crews would have survived? The questions had no answers, but they weighed on the men who asked them. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with 3rd Armoured Division, documented the division's tank losses throughout the European campaign. His records indicate that approximately 648 Sherman tanks assigned to 3rd Armoured Division were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair between June 1944 and May 1945. Approximately 260 of those losses were attributed to enemy armour, primarily Panthers and Tigers. Cooper's notes, written decades after the war, express his conviction that many of those losses could have been prevented if HVAP ammunition had been available earlier and in greater quantities. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Each tungsten-cored round cost approximately $4 to manufacture in 1945, roughly $65 in today's currency when adjusted for inflation. Each Sherman tank cost approximately $44,000. Each trained tank crew represented months of instruction and irreplaceable combat experience. The trade was obvious. Spend $4 per round to give crews a weapon that could defeat enemy armour, or accept losses that cost tens of thousands of dollars in equipment and measured in human lives that could never be recovered. But the tungsten was not available. China, which had supplied much of America's tungsten before the war, was partially occupied by Japan and could only deliver limited quantities through supply routes that passed through Japanese-controlled territory at enormous risk. South American sources could not expand production quickly enough to meet demand. Domestic mining operations in Nevada and California worked at capacity but produced insufficient quantities to meet all strategic requirements. The simple reality was that in 1945, the United States did not have enough tungsten to produce HVAP ammunition in quantities that would allow widespread issue to all tanks. Clarence Smoyer survived the war. He returned to the United States in July 1945, was discharged from the Army, and went home to Pennsylvania, where he worked in a steel mill for the next 4 decades. He rarely spoke about the war, a pattern common among veterans of armoured combat who had seen friends burned alive in tanks or watched vehicles explode from penetrating hits. When he did discuss his service, he talked about the crew, about the men he served, about the peculiar intimacy of 5 men living and fighting in a steel box for months on end. He mentioned the Cologne engagement occasionally, usually when prompted, and always focused on the technical details rather than the emotional content. The HVAP round had worked. The Panther had burned. That was the extent of his public recollection. But in private conversations recorded decades later for oral history projects, Smoyer revealed more complex feelings about the ammunition that had saved his life that day in Cologne. He remembered that Eagle 7 had 6 HVAP rounds allocated for the urban combat in Cologne. He used 3 of them, the Panther on March 6th, a Tiger tank destroyer 2 days later, and a final engagement on March 10th against a Panther attempting to defend a bridge crossing. Each time, the tungsten-cored round had penetrated and destroyed the target. The remaining 3 rounds were still in the tank when the war ended in May. They were never fired in combat, because Eagle 7 encountered no more heavy German armour before the surrender. What haunted Smoyer was the memory of earlier engagements, battles in France and Belgium during the fall of 1944, when his tank had encountered Panthers and had no effective ammunition to engage them. He remembered his company commander ordering them to withdraw because fighting Panthers with 75mm guns was suicide. He remembered tanks in his battalion being destroyed at ranges where the German guns were effective, but American guns were not. He remembered feeling helpless, outmatched, sent into combat with equipment that was inadequate for the mission. And he remembered learning in February 1945 that ammunition existed which could defeat Panther armour. Ammunition that had existed for months but had not been issued because there was not enough of it. Other crews across the American armoured divisions in Europe experienced similar arcs of revelation and frustration. They received HVAP ammunition in the final months of the war, used it successfully, and then lived with the knowledge that this capability had existed earlier but had been withheld, not through deliberate cruelty or incompetence, but through the simple arithmetic of material scarcity in industrial warfare. The tungsten deposits of the world contained only so much accessible ore. American mining and refining capacity could only process that ore at certain rates. The Strategic Materials Allocation Board had to distribute available tungsten across competing demands that were all legitimate and all important to the war effort. The Ordnance Department's official history of ammunition development during World War II, published in 1947, addressed the HVAP shortage directly. The report acknowledged that limited tungsten availability prevented widespread issue of armor-piercing ammunition that would have significantly improved American tank performance against German heavy armor. The report noted that by the time production reached levels that would have allowed adequate distribution, the war in Europe was entering its final weeks, and German armor resistance was collapsing not because American tanks could defeat it, but because Germany had run out of fuel, ammunition, and trained crews to man the vehicles that remained. The 4th Armored Division's unit history, compiled from after-action reports and personal accounts, includes a section on ammunition effectiveness that quantifies what HVAP meant in practical terms. In engagements documented during March and April 1945, 4th Armoured tanks firing HVAP achieved an average engagement range of 900 yards against German heavy armour, compared to 300 yards for tanks firing standard ammunition. The longer engagement range meant American tanks could fire first more often, could engage from hull-down positions where their own armour was partially protected, and could defeat German tanks before closing to ranges where the superior German guns held decisive advantages. The division history estimates that if HVAP had been available in adequate quantities from the beginning of the Normandy campaign, tank losses to enemy armour could have been reduced by approximately 30 to 40%. That translates to roughly 80 tanks not destroyed and approximately 300 crew members not killed or wounded in 4th Armoured Division alone. Multiplied across all American armoured divisions in Europe, the potential savings were in the thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of casualties. These were not merely abstract numbers. They represented husbands who did not come home, fathers who never met their children, young men who died in burning tanks because the ammunition that could have saved them existed but could not be produced in sufficient quantity. The story of HVAP ammunition reveals a fundamental truth about industrial warfare that transcends the specific technical details of tungsten carbide penetrators and armor-piercing ballistics. Modern war between industrial nations is not won primarily through superior tactics, better training, or greater courage, though all of those factors matter. It is won through material superiority, through the capacity to produce more of everything, better quality equipment, and the logistical systems to deliver that equipment to the forces that need it. But even the most powerful industrial economy faces constraints that cannot be overcome through willpower or determination. The United States in 1945 had the most productive economy in human history. American factories produced more steel, more aluminum, more copper, more of virtually every industrial material than any other nation. The conversion to war production that began after Pearl Harbor transformed American industry into a military production machine that supplied not only American forces but also significant quantities of equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allied nations. American shipyards launched cargo vessels at rates that replaced sinking faster than German submarines could destroy them. American aircraft factories produced fighters and bombers in numbers that gave the Allies absolute air superiority by 1944. American ordnance plants produced artillery ammunition in quantities that allowed Allied forces to fire preparation barrages that lasted for hours or days before major offensives. But tungsten was different. Tungsten deposits are geologically rare, concentrated in a few locations worldwide. The largest deposits in the 1940s were in China, Portugal, Bolivia, and scattered locations in the United States. China's production was disrupted by Japanese occupation. Portugal, officially neutral but tilting toward the Allies, could export only limited quantities. Bolivia ramped up production, but faced infrastructure limitations that constrained output. American domestic production, centered in Nevada and California, operated at maximum capacity, but could not meet demand for all applications that required tungsten. The result was a strategic materials shortage that no amount of American industrial capacity could solve in the time available. The Ordnance Department estimated in early 1945 that adequate HVAP production to supply all American tank units in Europe would require approximately 600,000 pounds of tungsten annually, allocated exclusively to armor-piercing ammunition. Total American tungsten availability from all sources in 1945 was approximately £2 million, but that total had to be divided among aircraft engines, machine tools, armor-piercing ammunition, anti-tank mines, and numerous other military and industrial applications. The allocation decisions were made by committees that reviewed competing demands and assigned priorities based on assessments of military necessity and strategic impact. Aircraft engine production received high priority because air superiority was essential to all operations. Machine tool production received priority because maintaining industrial output required keeping factory equipment operational. Armor-piercing ammunition competed with these and other demands, and the allocation it received, while substantial, was insufficient to provide HVAP rounds in quantities that would allow tank crews to engage all targets with the most effective ammunition available. Tank crews understood none of this context. They knew only that they had ammunition that worked, but not enough of it. They knew that somewhere in the supply chain, decisions had been made that resulted in 3 or 4 HVAP rounds per tank instead of 300 or 400. They did not know about tungsten mining in Bolivia, about strategic materials committees in Washington, about the competing demands of aircraft production and machine tool manufacturing. They knew only that they were fighting Panthers with inadequate ammunition because someone, somewhere, had decided that other priorities were more important than giving them the tools they needed. The psychological impact of this knowledge was corrosive. American tank crews in Europe fought with extraordinary courage and determination despite knowing their equipment was inferior to German heavy armor. They developed tactics that emphasized maneuver, combined arms coordination, and numerical superiority to compensate for qualitative disadvantages in individual tank performance. They closed to short ranges where even standard ammunition could penetrate weak points in German armor. They called for artillery support, airstrikes, and tank destroyer support when facing heavy German armor. They accepted casualties as the price of tactical success and continued fighting because that was their duty. But the knowledge that better ammunition existed and was being withheld, not through malice but through material scarcity, created a sense of betrayal that many veterans carried for the rest of their lives. They had been told that American industry could produce anything needed for victory. They had seen the abundance of American supplies, the endless convoys of trucks bringing fuel and ammunition and rations, the replacement tanks arriving to replace losses within days. They believed in American material superiority. The HVAP shortage revealed that even American industrial might had limits, that some problems could not be solved simply by producing more, that material constraints could force soldiers to fight with inadequate equipment even when better equipment existed. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. German forces surrendered unconditionally. American armored divisions that had fought from Normandy to the Elbe River stood down from combat operations and began the process of occupation duty. Tank crews cleaned their vehicles, conducted maintenance that had been deferred during the final offensive, and waited for orders about redeployment or demobilization. The HVAP rounds that remained in their ammunition racks were turned into ordnance depots, inventoried, and either stored for future use or, in many cases, simply scrapped because the tungsten carbide penetrators could be reclaimed and reused. By the time tungsten production reached levels that would have allowed adequate HVAP distribution to all armored units, the enemy that ammunition had been designed to defeat no longer existed as a fighting force. German tank production had collapsed under Allied bombing, fuel shortages, and the loss of industrial regions to Soviet advances from the east and American advances from the west. The Panthers and Tigers that had dominated European battlefields in 1944 were by May 1945 mostly destroyed, abandoned for lack of fuel, or surrendered intact to Allied forces. The ammunition that could have changed the first tactical balance of armoured combat arrived in quantity only after the battles were over. The final accounting of American tank losses in Europe provides the context for understanding what HVAP ammunition meant in practical terms. Approximately 18,000 Sherman tanks were deployed to the European theatre between June 1944 and May 1945. Of those, approximately 4,000 were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Enemy armour was responsible for approximately 30% of those losses, roughly 1,200 tanks. The remaining losses were attributed to anti-tank guns, mines, Panzerfaust weapons, artillery, and mechanical failures. If HVAP ammunition had been available in adequate quantities throughout the campaign, and if the penetration performance and increased engagement range that HVAP provided had reduced losses to enemy armour by the 30 to 40% estimated by Ordnance Department analysts, then somewhere between 360 and 480 American tanks would not have been destroyed. Each Sherman tank carried a crew of 5 men. The potential casualty reduction was between 1,800 and 2,400 crew members who might have survived if the ammunition that could defeat German heavy armour had been available when they needed it. These numbers are estimates, based on assumptions about tactical performance that cannot be verified, because the counterfactual history where HVAP was widely available did not occur. But the numbers provide a framework for understanding the human cost of material scarcity. 1,800 to 2,400 men, tank drivers and gunners and loaders and commanders and assistant drivers, young men in their 20s with families at home and futures ahead of them, died in part because tungsten was scarce and strategic materials allocation boards had to make impossible choices about competing demands. Lieutenant Clarence Smoyer, who fired the HVAP round that destroyed the Panther in Cologne on March 6, 1945, lived until 2021. He died at the age of 99, one of the last surviving American tank commanders from World War II. In his final interviews, recorded for historical preservation, he was asked what he remembered most clearly about the war. He talked about his crew, about Bob Early and Frank Odifred, and the other men who served in Eagle 7. He talked about the noise and fear and exhaustion of combat, and he talked about the HVAP round that penetrated the Panther's armour, about watching the tracer arc across 300 yards and strike home, about the flash of impact and the smoke pouring from the German tank's turret. When asked if better ammunition earlier in the war might have made a difference, Smoyer paused before answering. He acknowledged that HVAP rounds gave American crews a fighting chance against German heavy armour. He acknowledged that having those rounds in Normandy or during the Battle of the Bulge might have saved American lives. But he also noted that the men who made decisions about ammunition, production, and distribution were not cruel or incompetent. They were doing their best to allocate scarce resources across infinite demands. Tungsten was scarce. Choices had to be made. Some men died because of those choices. That was the nature of industrial warfare. This is the final truth that the HVAP story reveals. Modern war is not a contest of courage or tactics alone. It is a contest of industrial capacity, of production systems, of supply chains and strategic materials and allocation decisions made far from the battlefield. The side with more resources, better production, and the logistical capacity to deliver equipment to the front will almost always prevail, assuming basic competence in tactics and leadership. But even the most powerful industrial economy faces constraints. Some materials are simply scarce. Some problems cannot be solved by producing more. And soldiers fight with what they have, not with what they wish they had. The 76mm HVAP round gave American tank crews the capability to defeat German heavy armour at ranges that fundamentally changed the tactical balance of armoured combat. It arrived too late and in too small quantities to prevent most of the losses that American armoured forces suffered during the campaign in northwest Europe. The tungsten shortage that prevented adequate production was not a failure of will or planning. It was a geological reality that no amount of American industrial capacity could overcome in the time available. The men who fought with 3 HVAP rounds per tank instead of 300 understood this intellectually, but carried the emotional weight of that scarcity for the rest of their lives, knowing that somewhere in the vast machinery of industrial warfare, their survival had been weighed against other priorities and found to be not quite important, enough to merit the resources that might have saved them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.